Hi everyone, my name is Will Tillet. I'm an associate consultant with Aguaconsult and the global wash advisor for an NGO called United Purpose. Today I'm going to talk to you about a paper that I've recently developed with a collaboration with a number of organizations. You can see their logos on the screen, in applying wash systems approaches in fragile contexts. So, as we know, shocks erode gains in not only in improving access to wash services, but also in longer-term efforts to strengthen institutions, strengthen systems, strengthening the policy environments. Now, resilience is a critical element for sustainable wash services. But the issue of resilience hasn't really been widely captured in systems thinking and discussions to date, and only really started coming up around the conversations around applying systems approaches to COVID response. As we know, fragile contexts are largely off track to meet the WASH SDGs, and humanitarian crises are becoming increasingly more protracted. So, conventional short-term humanitarian response, which are focused on life-saving, are often not able, or frankly not necessarily mandated, to address some of the more chronic systemic challenges. The need to do rapid life-saving interventions in a context of weak state institutions, weak country systems, weak markets, etc., can lead to bypassing or substituting country systems. And that leads to something that Mason and Marcelo mentioned around how emergency intervention mode can be self-perpetuating, where it can fail to or not contribute to strengthening these country systems, strengthening governance, strengthening the market, etc., to be able to help to move from kind of protracted, long-term, recurrent humanitarian interventions to one which is more focused, sort of transitioning towards more resilient recovery and development approaches. There's also well-documented silos between humanitarian and development sectors that we'll come back to. But saying all these things, the grand bargain commitments and the localization agenda and the increasing trend towards cash and market-based approaches, the increasing trend towards more longer-term, multi-year flexible funding creates a good rationale and enabling context for applying WASH systems approaches in fragile states. So the discussion paper was a collaborative effort by a number of organizations funded by Welthungerhilfe's Sustainable Services Initiative. It's a discussion paper, it's not the product of research or a study, and it is a mix of theory, case studies and experiences, and those case studies come from where OECD would define as extremely fragile contexts, but also within the fragile contexts, examples from fragile areas of those countries. So, for example, northeast Nigeria, northern Uganda, etc. The paper seeks to sort of push the systems thinking and systems debate into a new area that hasn't necessarily been talked about so much around how do we apply these concepts to fragile contexts and to get resilience really into the agenda of systems thinking, but also to onboard humanitarian actors into kind of those kind of developmental approaches around systems, etc., and to try and use this as an opportunity to identify how to apply developmental approaches in humanitarian contexts and adapting humanitarian ways of working and also developmental ways of working to try and strengthen that nexus issue through systems approaches. So, rapid introduction to WASH systems. So when we talk about WASH systems, we talk about a kind of complex web of actors or stakeholders and factors, or these building blocks. There's lots of different frameworks for and sets of building blocks in the sector. Here we've used the Agenda for Change with its 8 building blocks. We talk about different levels within the system, from national policy to service authority to service provider to user. And the idea is that just like when you're building the foundations of your house, if the building blocks are weak, or the mortar is weak, and let's say the mortar is the stakeholders, the interactions between the blocks, the behaviors within the system, if they're weak, that'll undermine the ability or the foundations of the system to deliver sustainable services at scale. And this is just a high-level example of a theory of change, Agenda for Change, put together for why we do systems strengthening. And just to say also that systems approaches often require you to understand how a system works and where the systemic issues are to be able to impart change. So systems diagnostics are a significant part of systems approaches, and there's lots of different ways to strengthen the system from at different levels, across different building blocks, etc., all focusing on either behaviors like learning, coordination, etc., or some of the more factorial aspects like monitoring or planning, etc. So to think about how to apply WASH systems approaches to fragile contexts, we need to think about, well, how do WASH systems look or behave differently in fragile contexts to, say, low-income stable contexts? And whilst every fragile context is different, there may be some common elements that will vary context to context. So in the kind of wider contextual, sort of beyond the WASH system boundary, the wider country context, in fragile contexts, you often have the fragility aspect creates economic fragility, security issues, highly politicized and highly politically charged environments, often environmental fragility and water scarcity, often a kind of mentality of short-term perspectives and acute needs rather than longer-term planning, erosion of livelihoods and ability to pay, and also large-scale displacement. It can also undermine trust and the social contract between the state and its citizens, and potentially undermine the legitimacy of the state institutions. In terms of the actors and behaviours, so the humanitarian context often comes with a humanitarian cluster with its own architecture, its single mandate organisations, humanitarian focused mandate organisations. The cluster kind of specific processes and lines of accountability. Often you see that the leadership, the sector leadership of the state is often impaired and sometimes substituted by the cluster with associated changes in lines of accountability and communication. Often the skill sets of perspectives of the organisations that are present in country may be focused more on humanitarian than development thinking and long-term perspective, even for those dual mandate organisations that may be there in country. There's a rise of a range of different NGOs, often with humanitarian events, but also a rise of informal service providers, unregulated service providers, delivering services that the state utilities, etc., are failing to do. There's this issue of bypassing or substituting country systems that we talked about earlier, but also with often legacies or protracted crises where you have ongoing supply-driven interventions around humanitarian response that can create this kind of underlying aid dependency as well as acute kind of humanitarian needs. And then the paper itself also provides specific examples of relative strengths and weaknesses across the 8 building blocks of the WASH sector. So adapting systems concepts to fragile contexts. So we have taken that agenda for change conceptual framework as an example and made some modifications to that to be more broadly applicable. So we found that it's broadly, I mean, we're not adding more building blocks, etc., but we see that we need to add additional kind of systems within the work that we do within our boundaries and nuance some of the building blocks that's there. We also did work in terms of looking at within each building block what kind of sub-factors may be necessary to consider, and that kind of analysis that's in the paper may be useful for people who are developing building block checklists or systems diagnostics for fragile contexts. There's a need to adapt the systems diagnostic tools for fragile contexts, considering what I just mentioned, but also to consider additional elements around conflict and power dynamics that may be necessary to understand in terms of systems understanding in such contexts. Also, there's a great opportunity to use how systems approaches often use participatory stakeholder systems diagnostic processes or setting longer term visions for the WASH sector. There's an opportunity to use those processes to bring humanitarian and development actors together to undertake a common systems diagnostic, not only an understanding of the immediate humanitarian needs, and also to set visions, longer-term visions for the WASH sector in country, to which they all see how they can play their part and align to. So in terms of adapting that simplified theory of change, you see the areas in red where we've modified, with resilience coming in quite strongly throughout, but not only focusing on resilient services, but also resilient systems that support and enable those services, and resilient efforts to strengthen those systems and services. Given that there's well documented issues of poor water governance and water insecurity often being causes or aggravating factors around conflict, and sort of perceptions of state illegitimacy if they can't provide basic public services, we also see that there's the potential for evolving the objectives of system strengthening in fragile contexts to also play some part in contributing to wider peace building and state building efforts, in addition to the normal, the conventional kind of objectives around improving WASH services and the health, the socioeconomic impacts that they bring. So here we're going to talk about some of the examples of areas of the system to strengthen. So whilst many examples that are relevant for strengthening different building blocks or different activities in low-income stable contexts are also very relevant for fragile contexts, but maybe to nuance those and also to add additional areas. Also to say that in the paper we've provided specific examples across the building blocks, and here we're talking more about kind of different areas of the system to strengthen. It's also important to say that in some contexts, collaborating with government or working closely with government, strengthening countries' government systems can be problematic in some contexts where it might impinge on core humanitarian principles. And so in the paper, we do touch on that, and we talk about some pragmatic approaches to those contexts to be able to work around it. Also, we recognise that it's important, whilst where it's possible to do so, it's important to strengthen government systems, and that's certainly the focus in stable contexts around system strengthening, is looking at the strengthening government systems, but also the need or the reflection that in fragile contexts there will be times or areas of the country where the state isn't able to fulfill its mandate, and the need for resilient systems to strengthen other areas of the system around the service provider level, market actors, and also the humanitarian system itself. So in terms of strengthening the governmental aspects of the system at the national and local level, it will be around strengthening the foundations in government to be able to progressively take on that leadership position and allow for that transition from parallel systems to country-led processes and country-led coordination, etc., to strengthen their capacities in emergency coordination response, and also to more broadly strengthen their ability to deliver basic public services and in an accountable and inclusive way to strengthen that social contract and reduce legitimate grievances. In terms of service providers, there's great opportunities to adapt service delivery models and regulation and accountability models to be more locally self-reliant and less vulnerable to shocks and less vulnerable to times when the state can't provide that kind of ongoing external support to service providers. There's also opportunities to adapt service delivery models to be more inclusive of refugees and IDPs and more inclusive of different ethnic groups, for example. In terms of market actors, with cash and market-based interventions, there's a great opportunity to use systems approaches to build the foundations for cash and market-based approaches ready to be used in emergency response. There's the opportunities to strengthen the resilience of market-based actors and to strengthen the quality and relative regulation of the services and products that are provided by this kind of mushrooming of private sector actors that happens often in these contexts. Also, there's the opportunity to strengthen the humanitarian system itself in terms of its connectedness with development action, in terms of strengthening the stakeholder alignment and harmonisation in the sector around humanitarian action, and to strengthen the capacities in country for permanent institutions for preparedness and response. So finally, applying WASH systems approaches is exceptionally relevant in fragile contexts, but there needs to be some adaptations in the thinking and the approaches, etc., to nuance the differences for fragile contexts. System strengthening in fragile contexts isn't easy. but there are increasingly opportunities in an enabling environment to do so. Funding in such contexts needs to enable and incentivize system strengthening, and there needs to be organizational commitment for organizations that are working in such countries to do system strengthening. There's considerable potential to use systems approaches to strengthen humanitarian development nexus and build foundations for that transition from protracted crisis to developmental action. And lastly, just to say that we need to mainstream as WASP system, in the WASP systems community, we need to mainstream resilience and humanitarian connectedness, humanitarian development connectedness across the work that we do in system strengthening everywhere and not only in fragile contexts. Thanks very much for your time listening to this.